Well, good evening, ladies and gentles. A ooh, cold day out there today. Got outside though for a good walk and some yard work. A couple screws had kind of wound up or come undone there on the deck. So my son was mowing the lawn and I worked on that. But I've been looking forward all day to doing some reading with you guys. We've got some good news today to go over. And, boy, the news last night was controversial, wasn't it? But we've got some good news to go over. And I'm excited to be here with you. So let's get back to see what's going on with our buddy Yorgos. Right? He had become a gang star, right? Last night. And we had just found out that a guy basically said to him, if this dude disappeared, I wouldn't be all that upset. And he said that he would help Yorgos by giving him some tips on some races. So, there was a gigantic racing trust. It owned the legislatures in every state in which it did business. It even owned some of the big newspapers and made public opinion. There was no power in the land that, that could oppose it unless perhaps it were the Pool Room Trust. It built magnificent racing parks all over the country, and by means of enormous purses, it lured the people to come. And then it organized a gigantic shell game whereby it plundered hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Horse racing had been a sport, but nowadays it was a business. A horse could be doped and doctored, undertrained or overtrained. It could be made to fall at any moment, or its gait could be broken by lashing it with the whip. With all the spectators would take it to the desperate effort to keep it in the lead. There were scores of such tricks, and sometimes it was owners who played them and made fortunes. Sometimes it was the jockeys and the trainers. Sometimes it was outsiders who bribed them. But most of the time it was the chiefs of the trust. Now, for instance, they were having winter racing in New Orleans, and a syndicate was laying out each day's program in advance, and its agents in all the northern cities were milking the pool rooms. The word came by long-distance telephone and a cipher code, just a little while before each race, and any man would get the secret had as good as a fortune. If Yorgos did not believe it, he could try it, said the little Jew. Let them meet at a certain house on the morrow and make a test. Yorgos was willing, and so was Dwayne. And so they went off to one of the high-class pool rooms where brokers and merchants gambled, with society women in each private room. They put up $10 each upon a horse called Black Beldam, a 6-1 shot, and they won. For a second, like that, they would have done a good many sluggings, but the next day Goldberger informed them the gambler had got wind of what was coming to him and had skipped town. There were ups and downs at the businesses, but there was always a living, inside of a jail, if not out of it. Early in April, the city elections were due, and that meant prosperity for all powers of graft. Yorgos, hanging round in dives and gambling houses and brothels, met with the healers of both parties, and from their conversation, he came to understand all the ins and outs of the game, and to hear a number of ways in which he could make himself useful about election time. Buck Halloran was a Democrat, and so Yorgos became a Democrat also, and he was not a bitter one. The Republicans were good fellows too, and were to have a pile of money in the next campaign. At the last election, the Republicans had paid $4 a vote to the Democrats $3, and Buck Halloran sat one night playing cards with Yorgos and another man, who told how Halloran had been charged with the job of voting a bunch of 37 newly landed Italians, and how he, the narrator, had met the Republican worker who was after the same gang, and how the three had effected a bargain. whereby the Italians were to vote half and half for a glass of beer apiece, while the balance of the fund went to the conspirators. Now, long after this, Jorgis, weary of the risks and vicissitudes of miscellaneous crime, was moved to give up to the career for that of a politician. Just at this time, there was a tremendous uproar being raised concerning an alliance between the criminals and police. For the criminal graft was one in which the businessmen had no direct part. It was called a sideline carried by the police. Wide open gambling and debauchery made the city pleasing to trade, but burglaries and holdups did not. One night it chanced that while Jack Duane was drilling a safe in a clothing store, he was caught red-handed by a night watchman and turned over to a policeman who chanced to know him well and who took the responsibility of letting him make his escape. Such a howl from the newspapers followed this that Duane was slated for sacrifice and barely got out of town in time. And just at that juncture, it happened that Jorgis was introduced to a man named Harper, whom he recognized as the night watchman at Brown's, who had been instrumental in making him an American citizen, the first year of his arrival at the yards. The other was interested in the coincidence, but did not remember Jorgis. He had handled too many green ones in his time, until 1 or 2 in the morning, exchanging experiences. He had a long story to tell of his quarrel with the superintendent of his department, and how he was now a plain workingman, and a good union man as well. It was not until some months afterwards that Jorgis understood that the quarrel with the superintendent had been prearranged, and that Harper was in reality drawing a salary of $20 a week from the packers for an inside report of his union's secret proceedings. The yards were seething with agitation just then, said the man, speaking as a unionist. The people of Packingtown had borne about all that they could bear, and it looked as if the strike might begin any week. After this talk, the man made inquiries concerning Jorgis, and a couple of days later he came to him with an interesting proposition. He was not absolutely certain, he said, but he thought that he could get him a regular salary if he would come to Packingtown and do as he was told, keep his mouth shut. Harper, Bush Harper, he was called, was a right-hand man of Mike Scully, a Democratic boss in the stockyards. And in the coming election, there was a peculiar situation. There had come to Scully a proposition to nominate a certain rich brewer who lived upon a swell boulevard that skirted the district, and who coveted the big badge and the honorable of an alderman. The brewer was a Jew and had no brains, but he was harmless and would put up a rare campaign fund. Scully had accepted the offer and then gone to the Republicans with a proposition. He was not sure that he could manage the Sheeny, and he did not mean to take any chances with the district. Let the Republicans nominate a certain obscure but amiable friend of Scully's, who was now setting 10 pins in the cellar of an Ashland Avenue saloon. And Scully, would elect him with the Sheeny's money, and the Republicans might have the glory, which was more than they would get otherwise. In return for this, Republicans would agree to put up no candidate the following year, when Scully himself came up for re-election as the alderman from the ward. To this, the Republicans had asserted at once. But the hell of it was, so Harper explained, that the Republicans were not all of them fools. A man had to be a fool to be a Republican in the stockyards, where Scully was king. And they didn't know how to work. And of course, it would not do for the Democratic workers, the noble Redskins of the War Whoop League, to support the Republican openly. The difficulty wouldn't have been so great except for the other fact. There had been a curious development in the stockyards politics in the last year or two, a new party having leaped into being. They were the socialists, and it was a devil of a mess, said Bush Harper. The one image which the word socialist brought to Jorgis was of poor Tasmos, who had called himself one, and would go out with a couple of other men and a soapbox, and shout themselves hoarse on the street corner on Saturday nights. Tasmos had tried to explain to Jorgis what it was all about, but Jorgis, who was not of an imaginative turn, had never quite got it straight. At present, he was content with his companion's explanation that the socialists were the enemy of American institutions. They could not be bought and would not combine to make any sort of dicker. Mike Scully was very much worried over the opportunity which his last deal gave to them. The Stockyard Democrats were furious at the idea of a rich capitalist for their candidate, and while they were changing, they might possibly conclude that a socialist firebrand was preferable to a Republican bum. And so right here was a chance for Jurgis to make himself a place in the world, explained Bush Harper. He had been a union man, and he was known in the yards as a working man. He must have hundreds of acquaintances, and as he had never talked politics with them, he might come out as a Republican now without exciting the least suspicion. There were barrels of money for the use, and those who could deliver the goods. And Jurgis might count upon Mike Scully, who had never yet gone back on a friend. Just what could he do, Jurgis asked, in some perplexity, and the other explained in detail. To begin with, he would have to go to the yards and work, and he mightn't relish, that, but he would have what he had earned, and well as the rest that came to him. He would get active in the union again and perhaps try to get an office, or as he, Harper, had, he would tell the friends the good points of Doyle, the Republican nominee, and the bad ones about the Sheeny, and then Scully would furnish a meeting place, and he would start the Young Men's Republican Association, or something of that sort, and have been the rich brewer's best beer by the hogshead, and fireworks and speeches, just like the War Whoop League. Surely Jurgis must know hundreds of men who would like that sort of fun, and there would be irregular Republican leaders and workers to help him out. They would deliver a big enough majority on Election Day. When he had heard all of this explanation to the end, Jurgis demanded, "But how can I get a job in Packingtown? I'm blacklisted." At which Bush Harper laughed. "I'll attend to that all right," he said. So basically, they want Jurgis to go in and organize and get a bunch of people to believe in one thing, regardless of whether Jurgis believes in it or not. Then when it comes Election Day, he's going to swoop in and tell everybody how to vote. And the other replied, "It's a go then. I'm your man." So Jurgis went out to the stockyards again, and it was introduced to the political lord of the district, the boss of Chicago's mayor. It was Scully who owned the brickyards and the dump and the ice pond, though Jurgis did not know it. It was Scully who was to blame for the unpaved streets in which Jurgis' child had been drowned. It was Scully who had put into office the magistrate who had sent Jurgis to jail. It was Scully who was the principal stockholder in the company, which had sold him the ramshackle tenement, then robbed him of it. But Jurgis knew none of these things. And more than that, he knew that Scully was but a tool and a puppet of the Packers. To him, Scully was a mighty power, the biggest man he had ever met. He was a little dried-up Irishman whose hands shook. He had a brief talk with his visitor, watching him with rat-like eyes, and making up his mind about him. Then he gave him a note to Mr. Harmon, one of the head managers of Durham's. "This bearer, Jurgis Rudkus, is a particular friend of mine, and I would like to find him a good place for important reasons. He was once indiscreet, but